In October 1972, a plane carrying a group of young Uruguayans vanished in the Andes. What followed was not only a crash in the mountains, but a long confrontation with cold, hunger, fear, and impossible moral choices. For more than 2 months, the survivors remained trapped in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Against all logic, some of them lived. The story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 has endured for decades because it forces us to ask difficult questions. How much can the human body withstand? What happens to morality when survival is at stake? And what allows certain people to continue forward when everything around them suggests that hope is over? This is not simply a tale of tragedy. It is also a study in endurance, teamwork, adaptation, and the stubborn human refusal to give up.
The flight began as an ordinary charter trip on board were members of the Old Christians Club rugby team from Montevideo, along with relatives, friends, and a few other passengers. They were traveling to Chile for a match and what should have been a short journey across South America. The aircraft was a Fairchild FH-227, a turboprop plane used for regional travel. Crossing the Andes, however, was never a casual matter. The mountains are vast, unpredictable, and dangerous, especially when weather conditions interfere with visibility and navigation. A storm had already delayed the group, forcing them to spend the night in Mendoza, Argentina. The next day, with conditions appearing good enough, the flight resumed. The crew followed a route meant to help them avoid the most dangerous parts of the mountain range. But in aviation, especially in the era before modern satellite navigation, small errors could become fatal.
At some point during the flight, the crew believed they had cleared the mountains and requested permission to descend. That judgment was wrong. The aircraft was still surrounded by towering peaks.
When the clouds finally gave way, the danger became visible far too late. The plane was heading directly toward the mountains. Within moments, it struck the terrain. A wing was torn away. Then another section of the aircraft broke apart. The tail separated. The remaining fuselage shot down a snowy slope like a sled, crashing through ice and rock until it finally stopped in a remote valley high in the Andes. The silence after impact must have felt unreal. Then came the cries of the injured, the shock of the living, and the first realization that this disaster was far from over.
Many passengers died in the crash itself, while others suffered severe injuries. Those who remained alive were suddenly stranded in extreme conditions at an altitude of roughly 3,600 meters. The air was thin. The nights were brutally cold. Shelter was minimal. Food was nearly non-existent. Yet the survivors did something remarkable almost immediately. They began to organize. Instead of collapsing entirely into panic, they used the broken fuselage as a temporary refuge. They blocked openings with luggage, cushions, and debris to reduce exposure to the wind. Injured passengers were positioned as carefully as possible. Those who had some medical knowledge tried to help the wounded with whatever materials they could find. There were no proper supplies for this kind of crisis. Broken bones were stabilized with improvised supports. Clothing became bandages. Snow was used to clean wounds. Every small action mattered. Water was another urgent problem. Although they were surrounded by snow, snow itself is not a practical source of hydration unless it is melted. Eating large amounts of it can lower body temperature even further. The group discovered ways to melt snow using metal from the wreckage and the heat of the sun. The quantities were small, but enough to make a difference. Food was the greatest challenge of all. The passengers had only a few scraps left from the flight, bits of chocolate, crackers, and other tiny portions. Rationing helped, but only briefly. In that frozen landscape, there was no vegetation to gather and no wildlife to hunt. They were trapped in a place that offered almost nothing. The survivors were no longer waiting for a delayed rescue. They were entering a survival crisis.
The early days, many still believed help would arrive. Search teams were looking. The plane had disappeared. Surely someone would find them. But the Andes are enormous, and the white wreckage blended into the snow. From the air, spotting the remains of the aircraft was far more difficult than most people imagine. The survivors managed to recover a small radio, and through it, they learned the news that changed everything. The official search had been suspended. Authorities had concluded that no one could still be alive. That broadcast was devastating. Until then, they had been enduring suffering with the assumption that rescue was only a matter of time. Now they understood that if they did nothing, they would almost certainly die where they were. This moment transformed the psychology of the group. Their problem was no longer how to wait. It was how to survive long enough to create their own rescue.
The moral line no one wants to face. Starvation became impossible to ignore. Human beings can survive only so long without food, especially in freezing temperatures and under constant physical stress. The survivors knew they were weakening day by day. Around them lay the bodies of those who had died in the crash. Preserved by the cold, they became the center of a terrible discussion. The decision the group eventually made has become the most controversial part of the story. In order to stay alive, they used the bodies of the dead as food. This choice has often been described from the outside with judgment or horror. But to understand it, one must understand the context. These were not people acting out of violence, madness, or cruelty. They were starving human beings in total isolation, with no source of nourishment and no realistic chance of immediate rescue. For many of them, the decision came only after deep inner conflict. Some resisted at first, some cried, some turned to religious reasoning. Others thought in terms of mutual sacrifice. If they themselves died, they would want their bodies to help their friends live. That understanding changed the meaning of the act. It became, in their minds, not a rejection of human dignity, but an extension of it under the most extreme circumstances imaginable.
As if the crash, the injuries, and the starvation were not enough, the mountain delivered another blow. More than 2 weeks after the accident, an avalanche swept down over the fuselage while the survivors were inside. Snow buried their shelter and trapped them in darkness. Several more people died, including important members of the group who had helped provide leadership and stability. Those who remained had to claw their way through packed snow with almost no space to move and little air to breathe. Imagine the terror of surviving a plane crash, then waking to find yourself buried alive in freezing darkness. When they finally got out, their situation was even worse than before. They had fewer people, less strength, and more grief. But if anything, this second catastrophe forced an even harder truth upon them. Survival would require planning, discipline, and action, or simple determination. They also began to think beyond the crash site. If rescue would not come to them, perhaps they would have to leave the mountain basin and search for civilization. This idea was terrifying. The terrain around them looked endless. Snow-covered peaks surrounded the crash site in every direction. They had no mountaineering gear, no reliable map of the terrain, and very little strength. Still, staying put indefinitely seemed even more dangerous.
To walk out. Eventually, several of the strongest survivors prepared for an expedition. Fernando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vicentin took on the mission that would determine whether anyone lived. Before leaving, they improvised equipment as best they could. One of their smartest innovations was a crude sleeping bag made from insulating material, allowing them at least some protection during freezing nights. They also carried limited food for the journey. At first, the mountains deceived them. From below, distances are hard to judge in snow-covered landscapes. Ridges that appear close can take hours or days to reach. Each climb revealed another wall of peaks. The effort demanded more than physical strength. It required the willingness to continue despite exhaustion, uncertainty, and the possibility that every step might be pointless. After several days, Byzantine returned so that the remaining food would last longer for the other two. Parado and Canessa continued alone. Their trek across the Andes has become legendary for good reason. Weak from starvation and exposed to brutal conditions, they pushed through mountain terrain that would challenge even prepared hikers. They climbed, descended, endured freezing nights, and kept moving. At last, after days of struggle, the landscape began to change. Signs of life appeared. They saw evidence that they were nearing inhabited land. Then came the breakthrough: a man on horseback across a river.
The river separating them from the Chilean farmer was too powerful to cross immediately, and the roar of the water made communication difficult. Parado shouted desperately, trying to explain that they had come from a crashed plane in the mountains. The farmer, Sergio Catalan, realized enough to understand that these men were in serious trouble. He eventually managed to communicate by throwing a note attached to a stone across the river. Through this improvised exchange, the truth emerged. The impossible had happened. Survivors from the lost plane were still alive. Catalan alerted authorities, and the rescue effort began at once. After more than 2 months trapped in the Andes, the survivors finally had a path back to the world.
Helicopters reached the crash site in December. Because of weather and altitude, the operation itself was difficult and dangerous. Some survivors were evacuated first, while the rest had to wait until the aircraft could return. In the end, 16 of the 45 people on board survived the 72-day ordeal. The world reacted with astonishment. At first, headlines focused on the miracle of survival. People could hardly believe that anyone had endured such conditions for so long. But as more details emerged, especially about how the survivors had obtained food, the public response became more complicated. There was admiration, but also discomfort. Curiosity mixed with moral judgment. The survivors eventually addressed the matter openly. Rather than deny or hide what had happened, they explained the circumstances and the reasoning behind their decision. Their honesty helped many people understand that this was not a story of savagery. It was a story of necessity.
Life after the Andes. Survival did not mean the experience was over. The men who returned carried grief, trauma, and complicated emotions for the rest of their lives. Some had lost siblings, mothers, teammates, and closest friends. No rescue can erase that. And yet many of them went on to build meaningful futures. Some became professionals, speakers, writers, and advocates for resilience. Roberto Canessa became a doctor. Fernando Parado later spoke widely about endurance, loss, and purpose. Others raised families and lived full lives, shaped but not destroyed by what they had endured. Their story remained powerful not because they were superhuman, but because they were ordinary people placed in unimaginable circumstances.
The miracle of the Andes continues to resonate because it reveals several truths at once. First, survival depends heavily on adaptability. Tools help, training helps, but mindset, cooperation, and ingenuity can be decisive. Second, human beings are capable of enduring more than they think, especially when they have a reason to live and others to protect. Third, extreme situations can push morality into painful gray areas where simple judgment from a safe distance becomes inadequate. Above all, this story reminds us that hope is not always a feeling. Sometimes hope is a decision. Sometimes it is a routine, a plan, a shared task, or a single step forward when the outcome is unknown. For 72 days in the Andes, a small group of people chose, again and again, not to surrender. That is why the story still lives.